It's great to be here and talking to all you people. And this is actually the first time that I've presented this integrated model, but it's something that I've been working on with my colleague, Graham Begg, who's also a co-author of this work for probably about 20 years. And what I'm going to share with you is what we think is a fundamental unified model for gold mineralization, and the key process that we describe, or that we refer to as the FUME process, which is an acronym. See if I can move that window. Okay, so the big question that we ask ourselves as gold explorers is, can all hydrothermal gold deposits be linked to a fundamental underlying process, and the very great diversity of deposit types we see actually be related to second order processes, related to how these things manifest? Sorry, I'll try and remove that. It's not working. Okay. So the FUME process is what I'll be advocating for as the critical underlying process. And what FUME stands for is fertile upper mantle extraction. Helen, is it possible to remove this window that's coming in on my presentation?
Can our technical staff please help us with this?
Yeah, because it's just coming into my presentation, and it disappears when it comes back again. Okay, I'm not quite sure what that is.
Nosotros lo vemos bien y estamos transmitiendo bien. Ese mensaje de que sale en el computador.
No, it's only showing. It's on your computer. It's only showing up on your screen.
Okay, well, let's see if I can do something about it.
Ahí sí, ahí salió.
Okay, well, hopefully I've solved the problem. Okay, so the basic process that I think underpins all gold deposits is this process we refer to as the FUME process, which is an acronym for the words fertile upper mantle extraction. And the idea is that gold deposits form when gold is preferentially mobilized from an upper mantle source, hence upper mantle extraction, into the upper crust. And this diagram really shows you graphically the basic elements of this process. We have an enrichment in the lithospheric mantle, and then that enriched material gets extracted into a magma, which ultimately gets emplaced in the upper crust, and fluids exalt from that magma to make gold deposits along these translithospheric faults. And the idea that to do that, and we'll talk a lot more about it, it's driven by geodynamic history and and critically some sort of transient melting episode. So we've spoken about in the literature, we've published on this particular model before. So we published a paper in 2012 outlining this model, and subsequently, you know, the work that I've continued to do, my colleagues have continued to do, together with some of the other research that's occurred around the world, I think is really starting to reinforce this model. In this particular paper, we didn't refer to the FUME process, but that really was the process that we were invoking. So I want to talk about the really basic elements of this FUME process, the basic model. So if we sort of break it down into the four basic components of it. So gold mobilization, in this model, gold mobilization occurs because partial melting of the upper mantle source concentrates gold in a volatile rich, and that's going to be an alkalic melt fraction, which is subsequently extracted into the upper crust. Now, to actually do this, to get this volatile rich alkalic melt, we need to selectively melt that mantle source. We can't melt all of it. We just need a process that selectively melts it. To produce this component that can be selectively melted, we require previous metasomatism and related volatile enrichment of the upper mantle source. So if we don't have that metasomatism, we don't have a source that can be selectively extracted. And then finally, the most effective mechanism for this selective extraction is minor extension. Small degrees of extension will just partially melt the most meltable components. In all cases, however, to do this selective melting, then there's a lot of different ways we can do it. But in all cases, it will require an anomalous geodynamic environment. So geodynamic conditions which are not typical of the background geodynamic conditions in a convergent margin or an arc. So why do we think this is the process that is important in gold deposits? Well, there's actually a number of reasons. And these are the observations that we make when we look at gold deposits as a collective group. And the problem is that much of the research on gold deposits breaks them up into little boxes and gets focused on little categories. But what I think the key is to understanding them as an entity and understanding what are the fundamental underlying aspects is to see gold deposits all as all parts of a unified process, manifestations of a unified process. And when we do that, we make some pretty important observations. So firstly, we see a ubiquitous association between mantle-derived alkalic magmas and gold mineralization. And that occurs across a really wide range of geological settings. We also see that alkalic magmatic rocks that are derived from the metasomatized upper mantle are enriched in gold. They're significantly enriched in gold in most cases. And importantly, they're actually the only major rock type that is enriched in gold, unlike other elements like copper, which can be systematically enriched in basaltic rocks or zinc or their base metals. We don't see any nickel in ultramafic rocks. We don't see any background rock types that are enriched in gold, with the one exception of alkalic magmas. We also have lots of evidence for repeated periods of gold mineralization within the same region. So this is actually very common. It's the rule rather than the exception, which tends to tell us that there's some underlying source that we're continually tapping. We now have an increasing number of studies which link gold mineralization to particular narrow periods of time, which we can relate to anomalous geodynamic contexts. And these are contexts which generally favor things like strike slip faulting and or incipient extension. And both of these are effective mechanisms, as we discussed before, for mobilizing the upper mantle source into an alkalic magmatic product. And then finally, despite the fact that historically people have tended to attribute orogenic gold deposits to the products of crustal metamorphism, we now have overwhelming evidence that this is not the case. And one of the summaries is, for example, in David Groves's 2019 paper. So,
John, could you lower your camera a bit so that we can see more of your face, please?
Okay, how's that?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, so what I'm showing you in this slide is unequivocal evidence for a gold-enriched vein network in the upper mantle. And these are samples that come from Argentina, from the Tessara et al. Paper, and they're mantle xenoliths that are related to a gold province in Argentina. And it's interesting because in these particular xenoliths, which have been brought up from the mantle underneath this gold province, we actually see veins, volatile rich veins that actually contain grains of gold. We can actually see arrays of gold grains within these veins. So this is conclusive evidence that we do see gold enriched fluids, magmas in this case, moving through the mantle. Now, what we don't know when we see something like this is, do these veins represent the FUME source? In other words, are they the products that ultimately get melted to make these alkalic fertile magmas, or do they actually represent the product of the FUME process? So melts that have already been extracted from the source that are actually heading up to the surface to make a gold deposit, and we just happen to have trapped them on ascent. So we need to do more work to understand that. We have got quite a bit of evidence that alkalic magmas have a background gold enrichment. So here are some samples from the Yilgarn craton of Western Australia. which is a very gold mineralized area. And you can see that multiple generations of alkalic magmas, which are being extracted from this mantle source, are quite anomalous in gold, all the way up to about 10 ppb. So we're looking at a concentration of gold, something like 10 times the background. We see strong relationships in timing between gold mineralization and evidence of, in this instance, what's being described as late mantle-derived plutons, certainly intrusions that are derived from the fertile upper mantle source. This is a case from the superior craton, and what it's really showing is a very good correlation between the gold time, the gold periods, and these periods where these late mantle-derived alkalic intrusions are in place. So that's a pretty convincing relationship. So I think we have pretty good evidence that we partition gold into these alkalic magmas, and those alkalic magmas are then transferred into the crust to make gold deposits. There's actually, though, two different ways that this process could work. And one is that the gold is somewhat pre-enriched within the upper mantle in a network of veins. So in that example I showed you before in the Tessara work, those gold veins would actually be the material that then gets melted selectively. So the idea would be that these gold-rich veins have got more volatile-rich phases, therefore they're easy to melt and they can be extracted by that process. But there's an alternative process as well, which has also been suggested by some workers, and that is that what happens is there is selective melting of the volatile-rich part of the upper mantle melt that produces a volatile-rich melt, a low-degree volatile-rich melt, and that melt then percolates through the upper mantle, scavenging gold because of its oxidation state and its volatile-rich nature, results in a very favorable partition coefficient of gold into the magma. Now, from an exploration point of view, actually, these two models don't change much. Don't make much difference to our ability to predict, but it would actually be quite interesting to understand those differences. So one of the key questions is, if we're seeing all gold deposits produced by this fertile upper mantle extraction process, this FUME process, why is it? Why is the FUME process essential? And I think it's interesting to try and answer that question and ask ourselves some questions about, background abundances of gold in the rocks that we see. And we're starting to get some reasonable data on this now, and we can draw some first order observations, first order conclusions. So first of all, we see that pretty much all rock types, all crustal rock types, have similar background gold abundances, with the exception of these alkalic magmas we spoke about, of about 1 ppb. We also now know, and this has become clear recently, that there's no major difference in gold contents between the primitive mantle, the lithospheric mantle, and the crust. There are some slight differences, but no major differences, and they're all about 1 part per billion. So what this is telling us is that there must be a high degree of mobility and redistribution of gold within the Earth system. So it moves around a lot. So that's the first point. The only primary rock type that's been shown to be commonly gold enriched are these alkalic magmatic rocks. Therefore, it's probable that the FUME process is actually the only mechanism in the Earth system to systematically increase gold contents at a bulk scale. And here's a summary of the Saunders et al. Paper, which is one of the first papers to really look at gold in the mantle. And as I said before, their key conclusion, and this is summarized by my co-author Graham Begg here, but because gold in the subcontinental lithospheric mantle is the same as the primitive mantle, is the same as the crust, it means that gold is very efficiently recycled between the mantle and the crust over Earth's history. And this is different from a lot of other elements which typically get irreversibly fractionated into the crust. What we do see is that the median gold contents in refertilized or metasomatized upper mantle are significantly greater than depleted upper mantle, consistent with our model. we don't see any evidence that gold coming into deposits is derived from subducted oceanic lithosphere. We say gold's recycled. The main agency of that recycling seems to be mafic melts, peroxenitic silicate melts, not hydrous fluids, as has been suggested by some authors. And the shallow lithospheric mantle seems to be the most enriched in gold. So one of the questions that I've touched on before, but I'd like to address in a little bit more detail now, is I'm invoking this FUME process to explain the entire spectrum of gold deposits, and that includes the class of deposits referred to as orogenic gold deposits, which often don't have a particularly close relationship with intrusive rocks, but in some cases they do. So why am I invoking FUME process and not crustal metamorphism for those rocks? Well, several reasons. Firstly, the FUME model can explain the entire spectrum of orogenic gold deposits we see and make robust predictions, unlike the metamorphic models, which can't explain that entire spectrum. We see increasingly strong evidence for a clear link between gold-rich, mantle-derived alkalic magmas and orogenic gold mineralization. I showed you that in some of the earlier slides. But also, there are some really significant failures of the metamorphic model. So if you're going to use the metamorphic model to, if you're going to invoke the metamorphic model to explain gold deposits, you have to explain these points. So first of all, we see Cenozoic, quite large Cenozoic orogenic gold deposits sorry, that should be Cretaceous orogenic gold deposits, apologies, hosted in Archean dehydrated granulite in northeast China. So that stuff, you know, there is no crust to be devolatilized and metamorphosed in that case, and we've still got orogenic gold deposits, so the source comes deeper. We see a very clear post-peak metamorphic timing of most orogenic gold deposits. Once again, inconsistent with a metamorphic, crustal metamorphic origin. We clearly see multiple mineralization events in one terrain. So if it was metamorphic, we should see one timing related to metamorphism. The multiple sulfur isotope, the delta, the Cap33 sulfur evidence indicates a strong mantle contribution, particularly in the larger deposits. And then we see an association of gold-related elements in orogenic gold systems that's inconsistent with metamorphism of supercrustal source rocks. So yeah, quite a number of reasons why we think that. One of the critical things in understanding gold deposits, but actually is also critical in understanding just about all mineral deposits, is the role of translithospheric faults, or TLFs as we abbreviate them. Now, these translithospheric faults are an essential part of the model because they're essential in providing a continuous pathway from the upper mantle to the upper crust. And they'll only provide that pathway if they're dynamically active. So they're operating in a geodynamic context where the structure is actually moving, it's cracking, it's dynamic. But this is a really important point. You're only going to be able to propagate a translithospheric fault through the entire crust if the crust is stiff enough to allow that. And this becomes a particular problem in certain time periods in origins where you've got really hot, soft, partially melted or even melt sheets in the lower crust. So hot, soft lower crust is bad. And if we understand that, that explains many of the observations we make about the relative timing of gold ore formation in the evolution of an origin. The other point is, while these translithospheric faults are clearly important as providing pathways for FUME-derived products into the upper mantle, in many cases, in fact, probably most cases, dynamic activation of these faults will actually be the critical process that drives incipient extension, because in strike-slip faults, strain heterogeneity will do that. And by driving the extension, it's actually driving the selective melting of the upper mantle source. In other words, the FUME process. So in summary, these faults are both important conduits, but they're also important drivers of the extraction process of getting these alkalic magmas out of the mantle source. And this is a diagram summarizing this idea, the fluid-centric translithospheric gold model, in this case applied to orogenic gold, but it's more generally relevant. And the idea is that, in this case, a strike slip movement on these faults produces incipient extension, melts the gold-rich mantle source region, and those fluid melt bubbles escape upwards and ultimately lose their fluid quite deep, and particularly in an orogenic system, probably because of the high CO2 content, and then those fluids percolate upwards to make deposits. So one of the really interesting practical implications of this model for targeting, and I want to sort of spend a little bit of time on this, is when we ask ourselves the question, what controls fertility? What controls gold fertility at a regional scale? We have to understand this question in terms of two different types of fertility. There is static fertility and dynamic fertility. And these things will be somewhat independent of each other, but both will be required to actually form a significant gold province. So let's just look at that. So static fertility, what do I mean by that? That is actually the requirement for a metasomatized upper mantle source region, and because that's, you know, that's what we need for gold mineralization. So we need one of these upper metasomatized source regions. Now, the thing about this is an inherited property that is not dependent on syn mineral geodynamics. So it actually depends rather on the domain prehistory. So at the time that the particular gold-related dynamic event occurred, you'll only make a gold deposit if you do have this source region. And these source regions do tend to be relatively widespread, but they're not ubiquitous. And we'll talk about the constraints on that in a minute. The second type of fertility, dynamic fertility, is the requirement for a favorable geodynamic context that actually allows the FUME process to operate. And importantly, this is transient. These are localized, these favorable conditions are localized in both time and space. And where they're localized is driven by heterogeneities in regional scale geodynamics. So gold fertility then is the interplay of these two elements, but in general, dynamic fertility dominates at more local scales. So what this slide is just illustrating is the various processes by which we can metasomatize the upper mantle. So that's the key requirement for static fertility. And it can be low degree melting under an arc, the rearward parts of an arc. It can be low degree partial melting coming out of the convecting mantle. And these are events that can happen over a very long period of time. And I guess I don't have time to go into it today, but our current understanding of the lithospheric mantle and its evolution has evolved quite considerably in the last decade. And we now understand that most of the continental mantle separates from the convecting mantle in the Mesoarchean, about 3.2 GA. And when it first does this, it's very depleted. It's a depleted Harzburgite, but then progressively over time, it tends to get refertilized by these various processes that I'm showing you in this slide. So if we look at a study summarizing the gold contents of various types of mafic xenolithic material, it shows us the point that the typical upper mantle before refertilization has a composition of dunite and Harzburgite. So this is old Archean, the core roots to cratons, the sort of material that you would find diamond deposits in. And then over time, we gradually refertilize that mantle and the composition evolves to becoming more like a leusolite. And then we actually see veins of melt running through the mantle, and that'll usually manifest in mantle xenoliths as a pyroxenite. So basically the refertilized stuff has more gold, and these actual pyroxenite veins have even more gold. So collectively, these data suggest that, consistent with our model, that the mantle is depleted mantle is low in gold, and then the mantle is refertilized in gold by these pyroxenitic melts, only producing a moderate gold enrichment, but certainly we see evidence for gold enrichment And of course, it's also making by refertilizing the mantle, it's also making it easier to melt. We also see some evidence that gold is somewhat progressive, and this is not orders of magnitude, but evidence that gold is somewhat enriched towards the upper part of the lithospheric mantle. So in this particular diagram from Saunders, we're looking at the average gold contents of the plagioclase, spinel facies, so the plagioclase bearing mantle, the spinel bearing mantle, and the garnet bearing mantle, and those are just different depth related pressure facies. So we can see that as we move to the top of the mantle, we're actually seeing an increase in gold content. So what can we say about the scale and variability of static fertility? Because of course, this is what we need to understand in exploration targeting. Well, in general, it looks like the fertile source is generally large and widely available relative to the scale of gold camps or even provinces. So for example, the entire Yilgarn Craton of Western Australia looks to have like a pretty good access to the gold source. The entire Central Andes looks like it's got pretty good access to the gold source. But having said that, there is some important variability. So as you might expect, given this model, it actually looks like some refertilization of the original depleted Harzburgitic cores to cratons. The original Harzburgitic lithospheric mantle seems to be required. And I'll show you a slide in a minute from the slave craton that talks to that point. Secondly, while there isn't too much of it around actually, but where we replace refertilized old lithospheric mantle by young juvenile lithosphere, for example, in a delamination event, a lithosphere delamination event, the young juvenile lithosphere that hasn't had that history of metasomatism doesn't appear to be prospective. And northern China gives us a good example of that. And remember, there's a four-dimensionality about all these things. We've got to think about this in the four dimensions, as time as well as space. But probably the most important variability we see in static fertility is that areas of rifting and juvenile mantle input that form immediately prior to the gold event tend to be the most fertile within any province. And a really good example of that is the northern Wiluna belt of the Yilgarn Craton or the southern volcanic zone of the Abitibi. But I've also seen examples in arc-related terrains where, for example, the arc-related deposits of northeast Russia, where a precursor Jurassic rift seems to be particularly well endowed during a subsequent Cretaceous event. And I think the point is that these are the rifts that have occurred immediately prior to the gold event, within 50 or 100 million years immediately prior to the gold event. And I don't know exactly why that makes it more fertile, but my guess is it probably reflects an anomalous thermal state of the lithosphere at the later time of gold, and that thermal state just being a bit hotter makes that FUME process work a bit better. So here's a map of the Slave Province, which in northern Canada, and the Slave Province hosts both very significant diamond deposits, and diamond deposits, as we know, require cold, depleted old lithosphere that hasn't been refertilized, and it also hosts significant gold deposits. And it is actually quite interesting that there's a relatively strong antithetic relationship between the distribution of the diamond deposits and the related kimberlites and the gold deposits, as we would predict in our model. Here's some really nice recent work from Wang et al. From North China, which is a very interesting laboratory for understanding these processes. And what they demonstrate is that there's a major event that occurs at 120 MA where there's significant delamination of old metasomatized lithosphere. The basalts that are extracted at the beginning of the event at that time are quite enriched in gold, and that's also the peak period of gold mineralization with substantial mantle-derived volatiles. So not surprisingly, in the context of our model, that's the time where the gold deposits form. But then we see subsequent basalts derived from the juvenile lithosphere, and they show no evidence of gold enrichment. So that's consistent with the idea that you need to have the old progressively metasomatized lithosphere as your source. This is an example from the Yilgarn Craton of Western Australia, showing the gold deposits as the yellow dots. It also shows nickel deposits as red dots, but that's not so relevant here. And this is a map, a samarium neodymium map of the regional granites. And what the samarium neodymium values, the epsilon neodymium are telling us is really the mixing, but the amount of mixing between this juvenile event at roughly 2.68 or so and older crust. So the hotter colors represent a greater influence, a greater amount of this juvenile event coming into a pre-existing craton. And there's a very clear association between the areas of stronger endowment and where we see the greatest juvenile input. Now, we know very well that the timing of gold is not coeval with this juvenile input. It's something like 50 or 60 million years later, but nonetheless, it exerts a fairly significant control on gold distribution. So that's telling us something about fertility. All right, so now that was static fertility, but now I want to talk about dynamic fertility. So what do I mean about dynamic fertility? What I'm referring to is a particular time and region or volume in an origin where we see the coincidence of the following three fundamental dynamic conditions. So they all have to occur to make this, to give us this window of dynamic fertility. And that's, of course, the fact that all three have to occur is the reason why gold deposits aren't everywhere. So what we need is the coincidence of a continuous focused pathway from the upper mantle source region to the upper crust. And as I discussed before, that requires a translithospheric fault, but it also requires that the lower crust is strong enough. It's not hot, soggy, and melted so that you can't crack that fault through. So that tells us something about the conditions where dynamic fertility is going to prevail. Secondly, we need a process which selectively extracts the gold-rich melt fraction from the upper mantle source region, but doesn't also extract a whole lot more melt. So we don't want significant dilution of the FUME product. So it has to be incipient extension, minor extension only. So just enough to selectively extract that melt fraction. And then the last point, as this ascending gold-rich melt is heading upwards, it's not going to be any good if it gets diluted by bulk crustal magmatism or large-scale slab-derived lower crustal magmatism. So they're the three key components that we can then use to be predictive about fertile dynamic regimes. The other point I'll make is this dynamic fertility occurs at multiple nested length scales. And I don't have time in this talk, but there's actually quite a bit of complexity of understanding those various length scales. So what are some of the favorable geodynamic contexts for dynamic fertility? Well, I mean, basically it's any one that meets the above criteria, but we do see some patterns. We do see some that are common. So, I can mention some of these, but they're not necessarily the only ones. But what seems to be important is when you've had a compressive flat slab event, which is driven orogenic convergence, and that slab all of a sudden starts to roll back and you have a switch to extension, that seems to be a pretty good context for dynamic fertility. And that's really the timing for the Carlin gold deposits in the US, for example. That's the end of the laramide compression. But also, whenever we see a large scale, and large scale I mean on the thousands of kilometre scale, compressional anomaly along a convergent margin, that's also a favourable geodynamic context. And the reason is because a large scale compressive anomaly is actually very good at activating steep strike slip TLFs that are at a high angle to the margin. And the Neogene Andes is actually a really, really good example of that. The another context, which is sort of actually mechanically similar, but it's right at the end of a supercontinent formation, right at the end of an origin, what we typically see is significant development of strike-slip tectonics, right? You know, the terminal orogenic transition to strike-slip tectonics. Why is this? Well, we've crunched things together. You can't keep shoving them together anymore. So things start to go strike-slip, reactivate old strike-slip faults, and potentially tap the FUME source. And as I'll show you later, this is the basic reason why we see a peak of orogenic gold mineralization at the peak of supercontinent formation. And a really good example is the Tian Shan gold belt of Central Asia with the giant Murrintau gold deposit forming exactly at the peak of Pangaea. So it is a bit counterintuitive, you know, large-scale compression. Why do we see this relationship between large-scale compression and incipient extension? It's simply because large-scale compression is very effective at generating and driving, they're probably pre-existing, but reactivating strike-slip accommodation structures. Just to show you a few examples of this, the idea of the collapse of the Laramide, you know, the Laramide origin in the Eocene of the US, and we see the arc systematically sweep to the southwest as the slab rapidly steepens, and it's actually that when we look at higher resolution timing on this, we can actually see that it's exactly that instant where that switch occurs that we see the deposits, and that's been shown at Bingham and it's been shown in the Carlin trends. The Neogene Andes, as most of you probably know, the Neogene is a particularly gold endowed period in the Andes. Most of the significant gold deposits do occur in the Neogene. And what happened in the Andes in the Neogene? Well, we saw a significant change in the geodynamics. And if we just look at the Nazca plate vectors, we see that there was a switch to orthogonal convergence at about 25 MA. And that, of course, drove things like the strong crustal thickening, the uplift of the altiplano, et cetera, but it also provided a favorable context for gold mineralization. This is just summarizing the relationship between the assembly of Pangaea and the Tian Shan gold belt and the other giant gold deposits that occur there from Sasha Yakovich's work. But what it demonstrates is that we start to bring Pangaea together, and at the peak period at about 280 MA, when we've crunched it all together, we generated a lot of strike slip, and that's exactly when we see our peak of orogenic gold ore formation. So I'm sure one of the questions you're asking, okay, I've talked a lot about gold, but in convergent margins, we often see copper mineralization, and sometimes we see gold and copper. So how do these two processes relate? Well, what we would suggest is that we're looking at two separate fundamental processes, and I think we understand now what both these processes are, but they commonly coincide in the one area, the one deposit, not always, but commonly, because the same geodynamic conditions may favor both processes at the same location and time. So we're going to talk about the FUME process. We have talked about the FUME process for gold, and I'm going to talk about something called the Laux process for copper, which I'm sure all of you in the copper exploration space are now very familiar with. This is the work that Bob Laux has been doing for about 20 years and basically has resolved, I think, to a first order, the controls on copper ore formation. There's a lot of it was done in proprietary industry research, but he did in 2014 publish a paper which really sort of lays out the model. And because I think you're probably familiar with it, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but basically the model is high pressure replenishment fractional crystallization of hydrous arc magmas in deep lower crustal magma chambers. And the idea is that there's an unusual geodynamic state, an unusual compressive geodynamic state, which keeps those magmas down there, makes them fractionate, builds up volatiles, and for that reason produces very efficient partitioning of copper, sulfur, and chlorine into those volatiles. And then we see emplacement of pulses of bubbles of hydrous magma and fluid into the upper crust. So anomalous processes, they require anomalous regional scale compression. So if we look at a simple model on the left-hand side, the Louts process, which makes copper, ordinary arc melts, fractionating at the base of the crust, and then of course the FUME gold process. And when we look at comparisons of copper and gold deposits, we see quite a lot of evidence for end members and overlap. So this particular diagram separates out the intrusions parental to these things. And as you might expect, the gold deposits have the stronger alkalic signature, they're more mafic, the copper deposits are more fractionated. This compilation from Chiradia is also interesting, and it's very consistent with our model. It shows that there are two populations, one copper rich and one gold rich. And unsurprisingly, the gold rich population has got a more alkalic component to it. The copper rich population is more calc-alkalic. But interestingly, it also shows an important difference in terms of time. So the gold rich population is in place very quickly, consistent with the FUME process, a transient event, whereas the copper deposits are in place over a longer period of time, consistent with a progressive, protracted enrichment process. So we can summarize this in a model like this sketch, which is sort of loosely based on the Peruvian Andes, I guess, where for a particular arc, we might, if there's a compressional anomaly, we might see copper fertility along the arc, but gold fertility more strongly correlated with areas of activation of the old translitospheric faults. So one of the ways I like to summarize this is gold fertility has a memory. We see the same areas reactivated many times, but copper fertility doesn't. The copper fertility is just totally dependent on the geodynamics. So just to summarize here, my last slide, although gold deposits are incredibly diverse, I think we can understand them as various manifestations of a single, relatively simple fundamental process. And the small number of key process elements outlined here can interact in various different ways to generate gold. So this allows possibilities for innovative targeting. And I ask you to think about some of the combinations that might produce fertile environments other people have not thought about. Okay, thank you.